This program is recorded and presented by Chippewa Valley Community Television.
Despite what you may read in the headlines, the newspaper industry isn't all doom and gloom. In fact, one segment of print journalism, weekly newspapers, are doing just fine. We'll find out some of the reasons why in this edition of From the Newsroom, a production of the Western Wisconsin Press Club and Community Television. Hello, I'm Tom Giffey, managing editor of Volume 1 magazine, and today we're talking to Dr. David Gordon, a professor emeritus of journalism at UW-Eau Claire and the newly installed president of the International Society of Weekly Newspaper Editors. Dr. Gordon, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Tom.
To begin with, I was hoping you could give us the lay of the land, so to speak. As someone, you have obviously experience in academia, you have experience with this organization. Years ago, you were a newspaper reporter yourself
Way back.
For a time. What is the health of the daily newspaper in this country, particularly in Wisconsin? And how does the health of weekly newspapers in general compare to that? And what are the factors at work on either side?
We got all afternoon to talk about that, I assume. No, the dailies obviously are struggling, I think some more than others, but you see it here locally in terms of the way the Leader Telegram has contracted. Smaller size of the pages, fewer pages in the paper. And one thing that bothers me particularly is the lack of local editorials. They're writing very few of them these days and picking them up from elsewhere, which is fine as far as it goes, but where's the commentary on what's going on in Eau Claire?
Right.
And I think that's probably symptomatic of the industry. You've got all sorts of questions as to what's going to happen with the Journal Sentinel now that Gannett has taken it over. Is it going to maintain the kind of journalism that's gotten the great reputation over the years, or is it going to be reduced more to a Gannett cookie cutter type of paper? And that's one we'll just have to wait and see. I think that obviously the internet has had a huge impact on the dailies, just because it's something that they have not come to grips with in terms of how to use it well. But beyond that, it's things like Craigslist. Well, again, that's internet, but Craigslist taking away the classified advertising to a great degree, and any number of other things that affect their bottom line and the revenue. The weekly part of the industry, I think, is a lot healthier simply because it is much less dependent on the outside factors. If you're running a community weekly and doing a decent job, the advertisers are going to be there simply because you are the way to get to the people locally without having to pay much more circulation than you really want. I mean, if you're in Medford, Wisconsin, to take one example, you don't really care about reaching the readers elsewhere.
Sure.
And so you're going to use the local paper to advertise, and that provides, I think, a great deal of stability for a community weekly that's doing a good job.
Obviously, the advertisers have to be there, but they're following the subscribers in a way. If people weren't subscribing to these newspapers, the advertisers certainly wouldn't be spending their dollars there.
True.
What is it that is holding the subscribers in an era when fewer and fewer people have a newspaper subscription, at least a daily one, when you see circulation figures have certainly plummeted all across the board in the past 15 or 20 years?
They've dropped somewhat for weeklies as well, but again, if you're going to find out what's going on in your local community, that's the place you're going to turn. TV stations aren't going to cover a small community at any kind of depth, neither are the daily papers in the region. And if you're going to be able to be informed on what's going on in your own community, you've got to turn to the local weekly.
One thing that you as a journalism educator, I assume, look at within these weeklies is the quality of the writing, the quality of the reporting that happens. I worked for a daily newspaper for a long time, the Leader Telegram. I grew up in a town of about 3,000 or 4,000 people, Dodgeville, Wisconsin, which has the Dodgeville Chronicle.
Okay.
And growing up, we would kind of make jokes about our hometown newspaper and sometimes the quality thereof. what kind of quality of journalism do we see from these papers, and how does it compare to what you get from larger outlets?
It certainly varies, but I think that the really good community weeklies are written every bit as well as most dailies, if not written better in some cases. But yeah, there certainly is a variation. I think part of the question is who goes to work for the weeklies,
Right.
and that's one thing that we're trying to work on a little bit, is make that more of an interesting option
Sure.
for students coming out of the journalism programs.
Tell me a little bit about the organization, the International Society of Weekly Newspaper Editors, ISWNE, which is quite a mouthful in itself.
Yes, it is.
You are not, or have not been, a weekly newspaper editor anyway.
No.
How did you get involved in this group, and then what is the value of this specific group to the people it serves?
Got involved simply because 15 years ago the conference was in Madison, being hosted there by Bill and Jan Haupt, who were running the paper in Lodi at that point. Bill is an alum of UW-Eau Claire, and we had been in contact. He knew that we were having a meeting of the administrators of the journalism mass comm programs in the state university campuses in Madison, as it happened the day the conference opened. And so he basically extended an invitation for anybody who wanted to come over to the opening program. Several of us took him up on it, and it was a good program. I think, as I recall, it was David Marinus talking about whatever it was he was working on at the time. And we got really intrigued by the program at that conference, signed up for a couple of days there, and were really taken by the organization. The people are what make it go. People who are very much dedicated to good journalism and talk about it an awful lot, and talk about it in terms of how can we improve. So we joined it joined the organization at that point. Didn't go to the next conference, but the one 2 years later was in Galway, Ireland, and that was just worth sticking around for. And again, just made to feel so much a part of the organization, so welcome, that we have continued the membership. And after that, I wound up getting on the board, and from then on, it was just a question of being either in the right place or the wrong place at the right time, and moved on up. And year ago, became vice president, and then moved up automatically.
What does the organization do for its members, and what kind of a forum it provides? As someone who's worked in print journalism a long time, including, as I said, for a daily, it can be difficult, time-consuming, tiring, sometimes demoralizing job. And I imagine when you're working on a weekly newspaper, when the staff might consist of sometimes you and you alone.
Or you and an ad salesman.
Yeah, exactly. My uncle, as you know, edited a newspaper, and it was him and a few other people. One he referred to in his columns as sports/advertising.
I believe that, yeah.
But in any case, yes, you're only coming out weekly as opposed to daily, but there is an intense pressure. How do these people stay perhaps optimistic and upbeat, and maybe what role does this organization play in that?
Well, one role the organization plays is that they've got a hotline, and that is open to all members and is used fairly heavily for, I've got a problem, what do you people think about this? How should I deal with this particular issue? It could be an ethics issue, it could be a business issue, it could be coverage of a meeting where you're thrown out or not allowed in. And that's one way that you get support from other people around the country. And it's amazing how fast the answers come. I mean, I've seen that with somebody putting a question up there, and going to press tomorrow, I've got to have an answer in 3 hours, and they get it. And the other thing the organization is really focused on, and that this occurs at the conferences, are what we call the editorial critiques. People who are interested in having their editorial pages critiqued by their peers. Actually circulate the papers ahead of time, or the pages ahead of time, and then come in, and the discussion is very frank and at times quite critical, but it's done in a constructive way. And I think this has been worked out almost to a science by Tim Waltner in South Dakota. He's the former editor and publisher of the Freeman Courier, I guess. His son has taken it over. Son and his wife have taken it over now, and Tim is still involved. But Tim is really the guru behind the editorial critiques, and we go for 2, 3, 4 hours on that. Comments around the table and questions back and forth. And I have yet to be at one of those where everybody hasn't taken away at least one good idea for what they might do.
What is the value of the editorials in particular to a small community? One could argue that in general, the media has gone more and more toward opinion and away from fact. So I can imagine people saying, well, aren't we dealing all with editorial these days? Don't we just need some more straight-ahead good reporting? How do editorials play a role, especially in these smaller communities that don't have the other voices?
I think that's the answer right there, that this is the vehicle to provide the commentary on what's going on locally. And it's something that the organization stresses very strongly. We've had a number of instances where people have brought in papers, they have not written editorials in the past, and they go away strongly encouraged to think about starting an editorial on a regular basis. I think the value is simply that this is the way you're going to get people engaged in a small community. Again, just take any small community in Wisconsin. You're not going to get an editorial about what's going on there in the Leader-Telegram or in any of the other papers, unless there is something particularly spectacular that's happening.
It's like most coverage of small towns and larger outlets, unless there's a
something
heinous
sensational.
murder or a scandal of some kind.
Yeah.
The TV cameras don't generally show up, or the newspaper reporters, I should say.
Yeah, right.
Now that you are president, what sorts of initiatives do you have in mind for the organization?
Well, one is simply to continue a couple of things that are already underway. We started an internship program this summer. Again, this is an effort to try and make weekly newspapers a little bit better known among college students and let them get a taste of what the job opportunities are like there. Paid internships financed half by each paper, half by the organization's foundation. And I think it's $3,200 for an 8-week session, which is decent and living wage.
Sure.
In a small town in particular. And on top of that, the papers are providing some sort of housing subsidy or finding a place for people to live. And I think in one case it's a trailer in the publisher's backyard, but it's housing that works for a summer. And we've got 4 of those this summer. We're hoping to expand the program, but we will see how this first summer plays out. It's still in process.
And where do these interns come from?
Well, one is from Kansas State, one's from Eastern Kentucky, one is from SUNY Stony Brook. And
so it's a wide range
nationwide.
of people.
And one is from UW-Eau Claire, as it turns out.
Excellent.
And no, I had nothing to do with the selection process because of that.
We can be proud here.
Yeah, the locations are interesting. There's one in Oregon, one in Utah, one in South Dakota, and one over in Medford, Wisconsin.
Okay. Tell me, this is an international organization.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about the scope. I understand it is mostly American newspaper editors, but obviously there's representatives from around the world.
Yeah.
What does that international flavor of it give to the organization? And you were just in Australia.
Right.
What are the issues faced by journalists there, and how do they compare with what small-town journalists face here?
I think they're remarkably similar in many ways. We didn't find that there were huge differences in the outlook of the editors who were there or in the problems they were facing. But just the fact that it is the same kind of situation was, I think, revealing. Obviously, their politics are not the same as ours, but at rock bottom, they still face many of the same issues.
Sure.
I mean, we got over there at the end of an election campaign.
Oh, in Australia.
In Australia,
yes.
yeah. And an indecisive one. It took them about 3-4 days to even begin to come to grips with the fact that the coalition government could survive.
Yeah.
But no great difference in terms of some of the basic issues that newspapers have to report on. Beyond that, I think it's just simply a question of the general international flavor of things. You know, we've got a dozen or so members in Canada. We've got probably close to that in the UK, one in South Africa. We've got an increasing number now, we hope, in Australia, and there, a couple of other places, but English language papers, with the exception of one in Japan.
Interesting. Huh. Well, other than the editorial critiques, as you talked about, and I'm sure lots of sort of fellowship and informal conversations, what are the other things that this organization does at these conferences?
That pretty well sums up well, you know, again, it's learning about the place the conference is taking place.
Sure.
We had, you know, a fair number of speakers who dealt with things that weren't directly related to journalism, but told us a great deal about what was going on in Australia.
So it is a learning trip as well as...
Oh, absolutely a learning trip. Yeah, the conference itself and then the post-conference tour that was arranged by the host, which got us a real opportunity to see grassroots Australia, both people and places that were off the beaten track for tourists.
And you were there during the winter,
yes,
as it were, in the southern hemisphere.
Yeah, never got below freezing with the exception of one night where there was frost on the ground.
Okay, so you Wisconsinites were still
we were chortling about winter.
Pretty comfortable, yeah,
yeah.
I can imagine in the southern hemisphere.
Yeah. You had asked about other initiatives. We've got one that is beginning this year. We are taking over a competition that was run by Gloria Freeland down at Kansas State, the Huck Boyd Center for Community Journalism. And this will, if it works right, attract a number of academic researchers who will focus on community newspapers and their newsrooms and try to do some research that will have some practical effect and value. And you know, that's a new initiative for us. It's one that is continuing, one that the Huck Boyd Center had been running for quite a number of years with the National Newspaper Association.
It's interesting you mentioned the kind of doing the analysis, because I imagine there probably isn't a lot of data out there about circulation figures for these smaller papers. I know you just sent me a draft of kind of an essay you had written talking about you know, a response to a piece that had been in the Nation magazine about the decline of newspapers and saying, well, this one segment of newspapers is doing very well, and there are, you said 6,000 or so less than daily papers, and there's only about 1,500 dailies. So they outnumber by quite a bit their daily cousins. Yeah,
and actually they overcome them also in terms of circulation. I think about 55% of the national circulation is in less than dailies, so primarily community weeklies.
That's quite impressive, especially when, you know, all we've heard for years and years is, you know, Facebook and other digital outlets and what these are doing to journalism and how everything is moving in a digital direction. Here you have the printed word still weighing very heavily.
Yeah, now certainly weeklies are dealing with the internet, and many of them are adapting to it, but I think they're doing it in a different way than the dailies. I mean, the dailies face the problem of, you know, what do you do with a breaking story when you're coming out the next morning? Do you put it up there, let people read it on the internet, and then they ignore the printed version, or not? The weeklies have the advantage of coming out once a week. And so, you know, if a story breaks 2 days after publication, they can put something up on the internet and cover it, but also say, see the weekly when we come out next week, because we'll have it in more depth.
And I would guess, but I could be entirely wrong, is that just because of their size and their resources, fewer weeklies went online, say in the late 90s, early 2000s, when all the dailies were rushing to get online and throwing their content up there for free, and then realizing, oh, we're giving it away. Why would people want to subscribe? And maybe weeklies, because they were somewhat delayed in getting on that train, it actually ended up helping them.
Yeah, I think it probably has. There still are some that do not have an internet presence, although I think that number is decreasing rapidly. But that certainly is part of the equation. I think the rest of it is that if you are trying to reach potential customers in a small town, the way to get to them most efficiently, most effectively, is through the local weekly. I mean, and you're right, there are not a lot of statistics out there in terms of readership, But there have been a couple of studies that indicate that people read the weekly more thoroughly than they do the daily.
Oh, I can certainly imagine that.
Yeah,
First,
which means they're seeing the advertising.
As someone who works for a magazine that comes out every 2 weeks, you know that you've got a 2-week window for your article to be read,
Right.
for your ad to be looked at.
Yeah.
Whereas, I'm still a daily newspaper subscriber, but they tend to pile up, and you don't always get to them right away.
True.
And those ads and those stories don't necessarily always get read in a timely manner.
Yeah, very true.
What, in your mind, makes a good weekly newspaper, and how does that differ from what makes a good daily newspaper or what makes a good media outlet, period? Obviously, there are certain universal things, but what in particular for this medium, if someone out there is trying to improve their publication or even forging ahead, I'm sure there are people out there that are starting weekly newspapers.
Yeah, some, not a heck of a lot these days, but I think that the overarching thing for any media outlet is to be involved in the community, be close to it. I think the weeklies probably can do a better job on that because the communities are smaller. They are much more wired into what's going on, which creates some problems. I mean, if you were the publisher of a community weekly, you're probably, or the editor even more so, you are being tempted or pressured to be part of the community, and you very much get involved in organizations that your paper is trying to cover as well.
Sure.
And that could at least set up the perception of a conflict of interest.
I mean, and that can happen at any level.
Yeah.
I mean, certainly there's a lot of back and forth between the political class and the journalistic class at the highest levels of networks and the big newspapers. I guess how does the organization help these publishers and these editors kind of walk through that in a way that maybe they can ethically be proud of?
Yeah, there's one very interesting series of discussions on that on the hotline a couple of years ago, and the basic conclusion was, if you are involved in your community, that's going to happen, and you simply have to make it very clear that this is happening, and here's what you're trying to do to maintain the detached attitude when you're providing coverage. As much as anything, it's perception.
Sure.
You can be involved, and if the perception is that you're being fair about it, then you've got no problem. You can be utterly fair about it, and if the perception is the other way, then all the protestations in the world aren't going to help you.
And I suppose one thing that helps in these small communities is that people often know you, rather than being someone in the proverbial ivory tower. You're a guy they walk by on the street or see in the grocery store, and
or the coffee shop.
And they can give you a piece of their mind if they wish. But at least they know that you're a human being.
Yes. Yeah.
And maybe they don't question your motives as often, or when they do, they're able to do it in maybe a civil, person-to-person manner.
Most of the time. There's a great article in the paper that was put out to cover the conference, written by an editor in Georgia, who talks about some of the emails he's gotten, which were not at all civil.
I can imagine. I was on the receiving end of some of that
as
an editorial page editor.
Yeah.
We're almost out of time here, but I wanted to bring up something that you had included in this essay you recently drafted about the Hardwick Gazette in Vermont, which is a fascinating story, and I assume you know the fellow who is the owner of this paper.
Yeah, again, met him at a conference 3-4 years ago. And
tell us the story of what's going on with them right now, and maybe what, in broader terms, that means for weeklies.
Well, the person involved is Ross Connolly, who has run that paper since 1986 when he and his wife bought it. His wife passed away, I think, 3 years ago. And he is past his 70th birthday and is basically looking to retire at this point. He was hoping his son might follow him into the business, but that hasn't happened. And so Ross wants to do two things. He wants to get out of the business, but he wants to keep the paper alive. And he just put it on the market a couple of years ago. We got a few people who expressed a little interest, but as he said, turned out to be tire kickers. So finally this year what he has done is stolen an idea from a woman in Maine who used it to sell a B&B that she was running. And he has opened up an essay contest The contest basically specifies that you write a 400-word essay on why you want to run the paper and why it would be a good fit for you and your commitment to the community or your potential commitment to the community. There's a $175 entry fee, non-refundable. If Ross gets 700 entries, which works out to $22,500 in entry fees, then the contest is on. If he gets less than that, then things get refunded. But if the contest goes, he and a group of people from the community will read these essays and will eventually talk to the top one or two people that they feel are best qualified. And the winner gets the paper for that $175 entry fee.
Wow.
You know, as is, no printing press, but with everything else, you know, the building and the records and the goodwill. Ross has said he's gotten good feedback from people in the community who have thanked him for making this rather unusual effort to keep the paper alive. He also incidentally specified he would not take more than 1,889 entries, because that's the year the paper was founded.
So the survival of this 27-year-old paper is contingent on someone writing a gangbuster essay.
And for 699 other people at a minimum to enter.
Do you think he's going to hit that mark?
I don't know. He's a little bit concerned because he has less than 100 entries at this point. The deadline's August 11th. So there's still time. And as Ross said to me in an email, journalists always do things to deadlines. So he's hopeful he'll be deluged on the 9th of August.
All right. Well, I will conclude here with a quote that you attribute to him from 1989, and I think it wraps up kind of what the value of a weekly newspaper is. A weekly newspaper that is doing its job serves as both a mirror and a roadmap for its readers. The weekly newspaper offers insights and opinions about issues of the area and provides a forum for its readers to share their views with each other. The weekly newspaper demonstrates that individuals and small groups of people are significant actors on the local stage. And hopefully, with a change of a few words, that kind of manifesto would apply to most of us in the media.
I would hope so, but again, I think it's easier to apply it on the local level simply because you're dealing with a smaller scale of operation and people that, as you said, know who you are and can put a face with the name.
Well, we'll leave it at that. Congratulations, Mr. President.
Thank you.
And I hope you have a good term. Again, this has been From the Newsroom, a production of the Western Wisconsin Press Club and our friends here at Community Television. My name is Tom Giffey of Volume 1 Magazine, and we've been joined today by Dr. David Gordon, Emeritus of UW-Eau Claire's Communication and Journalism program, as well as the newly installed President of the International Society of Weekly Newspaper Editors. Thank you and have a good day.
This program was recorded and presented by Chippewa Valley Community Television.